We're now going to switch gears and talk about H614, Act relating to land improvement, fraud, and timber trespass. And we have, we've been joined this morning by Gary Kessler, who I'll let you introduce yourself. And just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go around the table, but I will say we have a couple of legislators who are experienced in the logging industry, members of the committee. They're to my right here. And
I did read everyone's bio, so
okay, good. I thought so. We'll let you introduce yourself. I will say that we have at least one new face in the room. If you would like to tell us who you are.
Sure.
All right, thank you for joining us. Go ahead.
So thank you very much for inviting me to come speak with you today. My name is Gary Kessler. I was asked what title should be added. I said house husband, but I was told that wouldn't work. But I'm retired. I worked for the state for about 34 years. 10 years or about I was worked for the state's attorneys. For about 18 years, I worked for the Agency of Natural Resources, and I spent quite a bit of time working on logging issues. Ultimately, when I left, I was the Compliance and Enforcement Division Director at the agency. And then my last 6 years, I was at Liquor and Lottery as a Deputy Commissioner. So I've been retired for a few years. I'm a little out of practice. I've been coming before committees, but I hope you'll excuse that. So this issue is important to me because when I was at ANR, this was something that we struggled with constantly. I was very dismayed to see a story on WCAX earlier this month, and I don't know if you all saw that. And there was a letter that they put up on the screen from person, last name is Bacon. And those were the same people that we were prosecuting back when I was at ANR in 2010, 2011, 2012. We would get judgments, but we would never have any success in collecting them. And I would say, I would describe myself as relentless in trying to get the money that the state was owed after we got a judgment. But there are those people that are effectively judgment proof or make themselves into being judgment proof, and they were an example of that situation. So as far as H614 goes, I think it's a good starting point. I would like to also talk about some other tools I think that could be added to the bill that would make it even more effective, I think, in the end. I'll start with some of my concerns around H614. I think it's good that it criminalizes this behavior, and that's important, and that might be an effective deterrent against some portion of people that are doing this. And I'll say from the beginning, and I hear this said all the time, and I know it's true, that the vast majority of loggers are doing a good job. They're good citizens. They want to make a living in the woods, and they do it properly. And we just have a tiny percentage of people that are basically criminalizing the conduct. And that's bad for everybody, the good loggers too. In the end, it's bad for the industry. So I think taking some action that will hold these bad loggers, or at least have something in place to hold them accountable, is really important. It's very frustrating to the citizens, I think, who get taken advantage of. And I'll just tell you just a short story about, there's a legislator here. I don't know how many of you were around when Tom Koch was in the legislature, but it's been a little while now. He was also an attorney. He called me one day when I was at ANR to ask me, saying somebody came to his door and he had some property that could be logged and wanted to log his property. And he wanted to know, share the name with me. Well, he happened to know me from a year and knows our families are friendly. And I asked who it was, and when he told him, I told him to run, never talk to them again, because otherwise he would get taken advantage of. So it's not just people that maybe are elderly or aren't really up on logging practices. This is somebody I think was pretty sophisticated. He worked here in the legislature for many years, and he was on the verge of getting taken advantage of. So I think it's really important that you're taking the issue up. One of my concerns about 614 is that it requires criminal convictions. And I think we all are reading in the news how much crime there is in Vermont now. And I have friends who are still at the state's attorney's offices, and they're just very busy. and they have to prioritize what they're going to work on. My concern here is that unless it's a very, very significant violation, that the state's attorneys will not be able to find the time to prosecute these cases. The AG's office might be able to. There were times when I was at A&R where I might be specially deputized by the Attorney General's office to prosecute a case criminally, but those were rare. So I think that's, something to keep in mind, that this is a good tool, but there may be some additional tools that you could add that would, make it even more effective. And some of the concerns around language, and if you want, I'll just quickly run through those. But in order for these sanctions to take place, somebody has to be convicted criminally. Again, I think that's going to be one problem. One of the other changes, and this is on page 7, line 1, and page 9, line 15, is that the property that's going to be seized had to have been used, in the logging operation. I think it would be better if it said that it could be used in logging operations, because to most people, a yellow machine out in the woods is just another machine, right? Oh, that's the one, I recognize it. They all look pretty much the same, and I think it would be very onerous for the state to have to prove that the equipment that's being seized was actually the equipment that was used on that log job. If the equipment could be used for logging and these people are using it in a way that is criminal, then I think the state should be able to seize that without having to say, this exact skidder was used, this chainsaw was used. I saw that truck out there. I think most citizens aren't out, taking photos of the equipment, getting the serial numbers or the VINs. So I think in some ways that won't be very effective because the burden of proof will just be too difficult to be able to say, this is it, this is the piece of equipment. So I would suggest changing that language specifically that it could be used in logging operations. So I was mentioning that a case, and I'll get into this particular case, but we had a case against the Bacons, and they owed us a bunch of money. And the state was owed a bunch of money for violations. And I finally came to the conclusion that we weren't ever going to get the money unless we got more aggressive. So one of the things that I did was get a writ of execution from the court that would have allowed us to seize their equipment. And we obtained that writ from the court. I had my investigators, we have investigators, environmental investigators at A&R, actually follow their equipment around, so we knew exactly where it was located. And when we were getting closer to executing it, we had to work with the county sheriffs. We did that. We also had law enforcement officers from Fish and Wildlife. They're going to assist us in making sure this was safe, because there were definitely safety concerns around these particular individuals and prior conduct. And we were at the point now where we're meeting with the sheriffs and we were going to go seize this equipment. The sheriffs told us that they would not seize it in the end. And the reason was because of 12 VSA 2470, which specifically allows individuals where a writ of execution can be exercised, protects certain property that an individual has. And the sheriffs decided that, well, this is equipment they use in their profession, absolutely true, and so we're not going to take it. So as a result, we were unable to seize that equipment because we didn't have their cooperation in the end, and we didn't get to follow through on that. And by the time I left the department, we still had been unable to collect the money from them. But that was the length that we were going to try to do so. So I do think that the bill goes in the right direction in seizing equipment. It's very difficult to, as loggers on the committee would know, to drag the trees out of the woods on your back. So you need to have equipment in order to do it. If they don't have equipment, that's going to really put them in a difficult spot, which is the idea in the end. And I would say, if somebody was a locksmith, but also a thief, and you said, we're going to seize your lockpicking equipment, I'd say, wait, I use that for my job. Well, sure you do. But you're also using it for something else. And it's sort of the same situation here. I'd like to see that exemption perhaps in that section in 2012, 2470, perhaps written in a way that would exclude logging equipment specifically if it's used to commit some kind of a violation, and where there's a judgment obtained, which is again where we were going. We had the judgment, we had the writ of execution, we just couldn't seize the equipment. We had heavy equipment haulers set to come in when we executed this to take it away, and it all just, went down the drain, unfortunately. I think I had submitted an article from 2012. I don't know if you all had a chance to see that. Get that getting sent around from Northern Woodlands Magazine, and it specifically talked about Vermont and the frustration we were having, and I'm quoted in there saying I was frustrated. I think this was shortly after we couldn't seize the equipment from the Bacons at that point in time. But it also talked about things that have been done in New Hampshire and Maine that have helped make this work better. And I think it would be worth the committee reading the article. It's pretty brief, and maybe you'll get some thoughts from there that would be helpful. Some other thoughts that I would share. I think having potentially, I know this is always a difficult issue, but I think it could be done in a low cost way, is having some kind of logger licensing that would allow citizens, it would provide a control point for state government, for people that are regular violators, in that they could lose their licenses. So that's the control point. It would also provide a control or help to citizens in that they could be educated to go ahead and look online at the Secretary of State's office and see if a logger's licensed or not. And I think that also, would be helpful. Again, I'm reluctant to put extra burdens on a particular industry, but I think it could be done in a way that wouldn't be expensive or a heavy lift, but would eliminate these more problem loggers. They wouldn't be licensed anymore. Be easy for citizens to find that out. I saw in that story on WCAX, a member of the forestry staff was saying, well, people could just look, just put somebody's name in Google and find out whether they're good or bad logger. I don't know that that's necessarily true. You might see some stories about some, but you're not going to get them all. But if they're required to have a license and don't have one and can no longer log legally, it'll make it a lot easier to catch them in the future, and it will help citizens avoid those unscrupulous loggers in the end. And then again, I mentioned New Hampshire and Maine. They have trip tickets for loads of wood that are being transported. Where did this come from? How was it harvested? Was the property owner part of this? Putting the mills. One of the things I worked on at A&R was salvage yard regulation. And as you guys have worked on, legislature's worked on since then, is this whole catalytic converter theft, right? So a salvage yard that buys catalytic converters that are stolen could be on the hook. It would be, another way to look at this would be if a mill is taking in wood that has been obtained illegally, they could be on the hook. That will make them a little more careful about where the wood comes from, making sure that if there are trip tickets, that this is all done lawfully. Again, all these would just be things that would help try to squeeze out these people that are basically thieves, that are just using, instead of kicking down your door and stealing the stuff in your house, they're, getting you to sign some poor contract, and they go out and just take whatever they want. So that's basically all I had, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And
really fascinating to hear your account of the seizure, the attempt to take that equipment a number of years ago, and then how you ran into a problem. We also have heard that A&R, we've heard this several times from several witnesses, I think, that A&R has very little authority to enforce the law here. What you've just described sounds like authority being used. Have things changed, or is there?
So when I was at A&R, we really hadn't. Before I was the director of the division, I did a lot of trial work, and I did some when I was still the director. But I also did brought a number of logging violation cases, some very large ones. Chet and Reginald McLean did some logging that was very destructive environmentally, and it ended up in the heavy cut law that got passed by the legislature several years after as a result of that particular case. And I was in Concord, and it was just a disaster. All the silt ran down onto state land in the Victory Bog and just made a general mess, and the property was left a mess. And they basically, give you an idea of the relentlessness of trying to get the money. We got a judgment against them after trial, and they didn't pay. But what I did is I just kind of kept tabs on them, try to figure out how we could get the money from them. They eventually were partners in some other entity that was trying to get some Act 250 permits. And the law allows us to get permit stays or for violations that are still existing. So I saw that, I immediately applied for and got a permit stay in Act 250. They couldn't get their permit that they needed with their business partners, who were then very upset with them. And then they came around and paid the money for the violations. So, you know, A&R was involved in these logging violations more for the AMPs, the acceptable management practices. So if a logger is out in the woods, and on a lot of these jobs that you hear about with some of these more criminal activities going on, they also have acceptable management practice violations. They're not leaving the place neat and clean. They're leaving it a mess for the landowner to figure out. So, you know, that's how the agency was getting involved in these. We're not representing private citizens in these cases, but we'll go on, and the private citizen who wood got stolen may get another punishment in that now they're, you know, there's a mess on their property and it's discharging it to state waters. They own the land, they're responsible to fix it. If we can't get the logger to do it and they can't, then they have to do it, which seems like double punishment for those particular individuals.
Representative Pearl, do you have a?
Yeah, I was just curious about, we've been talking some about bonding for folks that have been repeat offenders. And I'm wondering, in that case that you were speaking of, if the state was owed money, if that was, and my understanding is most state jobs are bonded. I'm wondering if that was, if there was a bond in that instance and you were still unable to collect, and if there's some barriers there that we should be considering, or?
So there wasn't. The work that had been done was not done on state land. These
Okay.
loggers would never be hired to work on state land. I think the state foresters are well aware of who they are. And so they wouldn't have hired them. But we'd get judgments from the court saying that if they were going to work anywhere, they needed to give us notice in advance. And of course, they didn't do that either. I mean, in the end, you know, this is a bunch of paper. And if somebody just wants to ignore it, they will until somebody takes their equipment and they can't log anymore. You know, or takes their house or whatever else they can seize in order to prevent them from doing it. I mean, this is it. This is how they make their living, and they're not going to stop. They certainly wouldn't put up a bond. And, you know, they're kind of working very much in the fringes in the end, and trying to find people that are, you know, that can be fooled, essentially, you know, don't know better, right? They've got a, you know, 50-acre lot somewhere, and you know, maybe it needs to be logged. Somebody knocks on their door, sends them a letter. And that's exactly what they do. They go out and find these lots, you know, through town records. And then they'll go ahead and approach the landowners, and the landowners don't know that these maybe aren't the people they should have logging their property. And the next thing they know, they're, you know, have a big mess on their property. They didn't get paid for the trees that got taken off. And I think one of the problems that we ran into was people who weren't involved in logging didn't really understand what these trees are worth, right? You know, you get some really high-end lumber out of some of these. Those trees are worth a lot of money, and it's just a tree, right? There's lots of them out there. So it's not, you know, less of a big deal, as opposed to, again, if someone stole your car, stole your jewelry, you know, you get a different reaction, basically.
We've had some discussions, there's nothing in the bill, but we've had some conversations about ways that we can educate landowners, the general public, so that we don't even get to a point where there has been a theft that needs to be addressed. And one thing that I keep thinking about when we have that conversation is the AG's office will put out press releases that make it into local newspapers, the smaller newspapers, saying, you know, beware of this particular scam. They may be targeted at older Vermonters, maybe not. Fish and Wildlife, don't go on the ice. It's not ready for fishing yet. And that's an article in the newspaper. People will read that, and over time it begins to sink in. Does that seem like there might be an avenue there for just public awareness?
Sure, I think that's a good idea. Of course, people have to read it in order to become aware. That's where I thought and I would say when I was at A&R, you know, we regularly put out media releases for violations that, you know, we prosecuted and got a judgment for, so that people would be aware, to try to raise that awareness, to try to create a certain level of general deterrence, not just to deter the particular individual that we find, but also anybody else who's thinking about doing the same thing. But I think the licensing component that I was mentioning sort of tries to accomplish the same thing. It gives some people a place, citizens a place to go to find out whether this is a legitimate business person, a legitimate logger or not. I suppose there could be different, there's trainings that FPNR offers to loggers. The game of logging is one of the ones they used to offer. And that could be noted in there that they're licensed and they've completed this training or done something else. If they don't see a name in there, and perhaps there should be a list of people who lost their licenses. So that's also easy for people to find. That would be a positive. Sending out these stories would be helpful, but is it done quarterly, yearly? How many times does it get picked up, and then do the people see it or not see it? I think one of the challenges for state government is somebody will call a forester and say, "Hey, I had this logger come and ask me about this," and they'll say, "Okay, well, can I give you their name and you'll tell me if they're any good?" They won't do it. They won't say, "Oh, that person, oh no, don't." I did it. I guess I didn't feel as constrained to somebody who I knew personally, but they're not likely to do that. They might say, well, you might look around for somebody else, or you might hire a forester to come help you find somebody to take care of your property and mark it properly and make sure the right trees are cut and that you get fair value for it. They might suggest things like that, but they wouldn't say what I likely said to Representative Koch, which is run. They're unlikely to say that is not a person you want to do business with. It'd be nice if they could, but I think they feel like they can't.
We have time for a couple quick questions. Representative Rice and then Representative Lipsky.
That was my question actually, was do you see any sort of specific mechanisms for increased outreach education to make folks aware? Especially, it seems like the particular audience is folks who aren't working with a forester,
Yes.
And I'm sure that they become the targets, like you said, for, these loggers go out, look at the maps and pick specific lots to look for, and they know who might be working with forester. So is there any way to sort of like target and reach those folks?
I suppose if people's property is in current use, we could do something, or you could do something with the tax department when they're dealing with current uses. Maybe include some information in the mailings that get sent out associated with that.
But if it's in current use, they're probably not in that target audience, right?
They might be. You could be still a small, parcel holder that's in current use for forestry. You might have a plan. But that might be one way that you could directly communicate with people that have these larger lots that aren't developed. So it might be something the tax department would have an easier time, sending something out that directly goes to those property holders. Just a thought. I don't know if it might be better ones, but that immediately came to mind.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Representative Lipsky.
Yes, thank you, Council Terry. Your testimony is appreciated. We've had a lot of testimony and we're expecting more tomorrow and other days. The one issue that has come up, because this bill has a lot of support from the logging community, obviously from this committee, Rep. Mahaly has been relentlessly engaging us in all the positive ways, and there have been some very sorrowful testimony of abuse. But one overriding issue keeps coming up, and it's fascinating that A&R got slammed with the same thing, that is the chain of enforcement. And when you go to the county forester and they say no power, you go to FPR, they got no power, you go to local police, we don't know how to deal with this. Go Sheriff's Department, you all had them on the hook, and just when you're about to set them, they said, no, these are tools for their livelihood, so they're not comfortable. Then you go to the state's attorney, then you go to the attorney general. That level of failure, we need to find that's a big challenge, and one I think we want to find a vehicle. And as we know, there are 800 pending backlog cases in Lamoille County, not about forcing, but just criminal.
Well, then that
Statewide, there are hundreds of thousands of backlog cases. So, and enforcement's a big thing I've dealt with. We've added things like licensing in other states and regions. Some of them are a matter of paying $25. You can cut up to 25,000 or 50,000 feet on your own land without being licensed, et cetera. To Representative Rice's point, if you are in use value appraisal, current use, you do have to have a management plan, and it has to be a licensed forester writing that plan, signing off on it. It has to be followed. If that doesn't happen, you're taken out of current use. So that those owners, and that might be 25 acres or larger, are not as vulnerable.
We did see some instances where they still got taken advantage of. Even though there was a plan, they ended up, they were trying to execute on the plan and they just hired loggers that weren't, they did it themselves. They had a forester that created the plan, but they hired their own loggers and they still got ripped off basically. And they were left a mess, and threatened, more harm to the victim, right? I mean, now you have to clean up the mess and maybe you get kicked out of current use because you said we were going to, protect this area and the logger went in and cut that down to nothing.
And we have a big problem with that double victimizing the landowner.
I see Representative O'Brien has been reading on Zoom. John, do you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Just one question for Mr. Kessler was that in addition to a state registry, yesterday we were talking about sort of Yelp style reviews, and would it make sense for a trade organization like the Professional Loggers of the Northeast, to create some sort of registry with reviews, or even it could be positive for the good logging companies as far as what kind of jobs they do, what kind of equipment they have, but also there'd be a place for even loggers who don't belong to that trade group to be listed and reviewed, just so they could be red flagged if these bad apples kept coming up.
I think that's a fine idea, except that the legislature doesn't have control over them, but you do over licensing. So, you can easily say, Secretary of State's office, you'll do X, Y, and Z, or Forest and Parks, you'll do this. But you can't tell a trade organization that you need to, have reviews on your website for people to be able to check. They might want to do it, but can't be required. The same way, a change in the law would do that. And again, I think a lot of this could be prevented with better education, outreach, but having a place that citizen can go and see, oh, wow, this guy's on the disbarred list for logging. I'm definitely not going to hire him, or he's not shown as licensed. And getting citizens to be able to ask that question, well, you're a licensed logger? Can I see your license? I'll check the Secretary of State's page. That would be something very positive that they could do from that perspective.
Thank you for your suggestions. Committee, we will pick this subject up again either later today or tomorrow. We want to have a conversation about various ideas that have surfaced on what we might do to make this make enforcement even more likely successful.
But I don't know if you've had a chance to speak to the A&R compliance enforcement folks, but again, they are, at least when I left, and I did speak to a colleague now who's over there, they're still prosecuting logging violations. So they're interested in this area. They want to protect the environment and make sure that logging is done in compliance with AMPs. So that might be a, good group to speak with.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.
So don't go very far. Our next witness